Welcome back, I'm Himmeli and this is Floral Art Review. Now this video was due out about 4 days ago. For those of you who were waiting on it to be released, I miscalculated the time that it would take me to be involved in a local agricultural show, a regional show here, and I had entries to put in there and a bit of travel time as well, so by the time I got myself organised, the days just flew by. So here we have now the review of Bark and Roses that was due, as I said, 4 days ago. So the space allowed for this design was 70 centimetres. It was judged from the front, and as you can see, it was on a double-sided table. So the displays behind it affect a little bit the image that I've got for you and for AI to analyse. But the design itself, it's a very common class title that we see in schedules, and I wanted to do something different. And so what I thought I would do is use a different kind of structure, because usually with Bark and Roses, it's a big piece of bark and the roses are inside it, or variations on that theme. And I have done that myself. So I thought this time around, given the time of year it was, that the big pieces of bark are not as accessible as the smaller pieces that have been shed from the trees. And so I thought, well, I'll use those because there's lots of angles in them. And because there was lots of angles in them, I thought that's going to give me contrast with the roses. And if I go with soft foliage, it's going to give me a contrast with the foliage as well. So what else have I got that's angular in terms of a structure that I can use? And what I had lying around was a wreath shape that I had made in the Scandinavian Himmeli technique. And I'll put a link to how you do that in the description for this video. But basically it's using paper drinking straws, and you make a single shape, and then you add the shapes together to give you the wreath, the final wreath shape, in lots of different sizes depending on the length of the drinking straw that you use. You can also use metal rods, all sorts of other things that are hollow to make it. But what it gave me was a nice, angular, interesting structure that wasn't dominating. In a sense, I was testing the judge because it's made out of paper. It should be okay in terms of being considered plant material rather than an embellishment. And it's on a metal stand so that I was able to sit, the arrangement that is at the top, I was able to sit on the stand so that supported it while still looking like it was part of this structure that was hanging off that stand, the wreath shape that was hanging off the stand. So in the design itself, apart from the bark, I've got some what is known as woolly bush in this country. It's an Australian native, so it's a nice, soft, feathery foliage and some yellow roses. And I've cascaded them down one side of the wreath shape. The design itself didn't win a prize at this show, and I was a bit put out because I thought it was a very different interpretation. But knowing the judge and knowing that she's very traditional, I guess I have to temper that with knowing that it wouldn't be to her taste, as fair as she is. And the comment that she gave me afterwards was that she was intrigued by the structure and the shape, but it didn't balance. It is top heavy, and she's right, it is top heavy. When I look at it now, it is top heavy. It needs the yellow of the roses reflected somewhere along the bottom curve of that wreath shape. So introduce that colour again. So it might just be a couple more roses in that area, a smaller sort of a corsage size of arrangement sitting in that bottom section, so that it is almost like it's a reflection of the arrangement that is at the top of the design itself. So let's now have a look at our AI analysis and see what it can tell us about how it meets the principles and elements of design. So the overall impression, first of all, this design explores the tension between raw rugged bark and the cultivated refinement of yellow roses. It is sculptural, architectural and concept driven with strong structural intent. The dialogue between natural weathered timber and geometric framework creates an intriguing fusion of organic and constructed form. So this is what I was thinking about in my interpretation. I just haven't executed it as well as I could have done. Looking now at the individual principles and elements of design, line first of all, Line is the dominant element. The vertical bark trunk establishes strong structural axis. Angular geometric forms introduce dynamic directional lines. The roses are positioned along a diagonal sweep, softening the rigidity, and the bark fragments project outward, creating irregular, expressive movement. The contrast between sharp geometric lines in the structure and the fractured organic line of the bark is highly effective. So if you took out the roses and that rose line, or if I had it reflected in the bottom there, the tension between the line elements would be even more enhanced. And I think that that's a good assessment analysis of this design as it stands now. Form. The design is clearly three-dimensional and sculptural. So that's good because it means that there's seen depth in the design, which is often difficult for us to get. The central upright structure creates a tree-like silhouette. The geometric armature forms a partial sphere or fractured halo around the core. Roses are grouped rather than dispersed, creating a defined floral mass. There is strong interplay between organic, irregular form of the bark, structured geometric form of the framework, and the soft, rounded form of the roses. So there's interplay between those forms, and they are contrasting forms in that sense, but they're not creating dissonance in the design. It's still subtle enough in the placements for it to still become part of a whole design, rather than this is fighting with this, is fighting with this. Colour. The colour palette is restrained with deep brown bark, fresh green foliage, vibrant yellow roses, and a neutral frame. The yellow roses provide luminous contrast against the dark bark. The colour relationship is bold but controlled. And now, just when I'm looking at that, I'm thinking that I know I had the Himmeli wreath already made, the shape, but had I used paper straws that were gold rather than silver, because it's a silver stripe through them, if it had been a gold stripe, and rather than white on the paper straw, if it was I've got another one, but I've made a smaller one that is just like a bamboo-y bony colour, that would have worked better in this design than this very stark white and the silver, because that's not reflected. There's no white and there's no silver. Now, had I used white roses, that might have helped the design, but it wouldn't have had the same sort of impact because it would be too much of a contrast with the dark bark. So all of those things we have to balance out when we're thinking about all of the parts of a design. Texture. Texture is a major strength of this design. Rough weathered bark, smooth polished rods, which are the straws, velvety rose petals, and soft feathery foliage. The tactile contrast is immediate and engaging. This directly supports the title bark and roses. There is an immediate contrast that you can see, but as it said earlier, the textural contrast is not the main feature of this design, and there's almost too, for me, there's too much rough. There's the smoothness and the velvetiness of the roses, but the angular placements of the bark are quite dominating in terms of their line and therefore their the structure itself. So I have to really balance that out a little bit more. And I think just having that extra line of floral material, flowers in the yellow would help to soften that. Space. There is a strong use of open space within the metal framework. Negative space inside the geometric structure allows light to pass through. The roses occupy one primary quadrant, creating asymmetrical balance. However, some areas of bark are dense, reducing breathing space. So exactly what I was thinking in the earlier analysis is that there's probably a little bit too much bark in it, and I need to rethink those placements a little bit better so that there's a little bit, there's definitely space at the bottom, towards the bottom of the design, but not so much at the top. And I think that's why it's feeling like it's top heavy, because there's so much mass there at the top and no breathing space around the plant material. Balance. The design is asymmetrically balanced. Floral weight sits predominantly on the right side. Bark mass and vertical trunk counterbalance the rose placement. The base appears stable though visually heavy at the lower centre. So that's because I've got one very large piece of bark at that area there, and I think a lot of that was to cover the stand behind. So I have to think a little bit more clearly about the stand I'm using and about where your eye is drawn, rather than just doing my drawing in a book and deciding, yeah, that will look right on night, shall we say. Rhythm. Rhythm is created through repetition of roses along a directional sweep, repetition of angular shapes, repetition of bark shards radiating outward. The eye moves from base, upward trunk, across the roses, back through the geometric frame. To me, I go up and down the roses and then just follow the wreath around and come back up to the top again. So it's just interesting that when we're looking for rhythm, we see different things in a design to what the judge might be seeing. So with rhythm, I think it's about repetition. That's the easiest way to get rhythm in a design, is to have that repetition, whether it's the plant material or it's the structures. You have 2 or 3 structures that are the same, those sorts of things. Contrast. Contrast is the strongest principle at work. Natural versus constructed, rough versus smooth, dark versus bright, angular versus rounded. The design thrives on contrast. So it's contrast in the forms and the line rather than the colours or the textures, and that's interesting to me because, as you know, I always think that texture is my greatest contrast in a design, and this was done not so long ago, probably 3 years ago. So it's just an interesting development that I'm tending more, even in that shorter period of time, tending more towards the textural contrast than I was even just 3 years ago. Dominance. Dominance is shared between the bark structure and the yellow roses. So structural dominance versus colour dominance. The dual focal area works conceptually but could be refined so that one leads more clearly and the other supports. So what it's saying there is that we've got 2 areas of dominance. So the structure itself with the bark and the wreath shape, and the yellow roses, because of their colour, they are dominant. So if I put that second placement of yellow roses in the bottom half, then colour would become the dominant part of the design, and that's what it's asking for. It's saying, that at the moment there's a conflict between what is the most dominant part of the design, whether it's the structure or the roses. And unless your structure is completely plant material, you want something else that is plant material to be the dominant part of your design. So I need to improve that. Proportion and scale. The roses are appropriately scaled to the structure, but some bark fragments feel slightly oversized in relation to the delicate framework. The geometric structure could be either slightly larger for more drama or slightly reduced for refinement. At competition level, precision in proportional relationships becomes critical. So I think that I've lost out in terms of proportion with this design. I think that it's right about the bark. Some of the bark is just too big for it and there's too much of it. And I think that had I had even that same size of the Himmeli wreath, but in the bone coloured straws or a gold colour, not so much gold because that would be too dominant, but something that blended better with the other colours in the design would help in terms of proportion and scale. It would look more in proportion and it would look more in scale. So this is a new section that we've introduced in terms of our analysis, and it's called concept communication. So this is about how well does the design fit the brief, the class title. And that's come about because we've had a lot of questions through our monthly competitions at Floral Art Online about how they interpret a class title, particularly for people starting out. It's about, well, how do I tell it? And the trap that in all of our early design work, me included, is that you interpret it with embellishments rather than the plant material. And the simplest way I can put it is that when a judge looks at your design, it should scream the class title. So there shouldn't be any doubt in their mind at all about what the class title is. Now with this one, we can see that it's predominantly bark and roses, so we know that must have been the class title. So the title Bark and Roses is clearly expressed. The material dialogue is evident. The emotional tone suggests strength, protecting fragility. To elevate this further, consider a clearer narrative direction. Is it growth emerging from the structure, protection, confinement, or integration? More deliberate placement of floral material within the geometric armature. So that's what I'm saying about that bottom placement of roses. I think is just going to make all the difference in that design. Not the same size, much smaller size, as I said, so it looks like it's just a reflection, but we'll get that repetition, so we'll get that balance that comes with the repetition and then the rhythm that comes with that as well. So let's look at what it's suggesting now for some refinements apart from the more deliberate placement of floral material. Edit bark pieces for a cleaner directional movement. So that's very true. I think that I just used the bark as I picked it up. I didn't think too much about directions it was going other than they were nice straight pieces. So that needs to be more intentional, the placements of the bark and the sizes of it as well. Clarify primary focal point, either structure leads or roses leads, so either structure or colour. And we talked about that. Increase intentional negative space. So once again, I've talked about that on the way through. It's about having a little bit more space at the top of that design so that there is a generally negative space all through the design rather than only in the bottom half of the design. Refine proportional relationship between metal geometry and bark mass. So this is about the Himmeli wreath, which is seen as metal because the shiny parts of the straws are showing, and the bark mass. So I think, as I said, that if it was a different colour, it would be better. It would work better with the bark, and it would be a little bit more sympathetic to the whole of the design. Slight variation in rose maturity for added nuance. So what it's suggesting there is that we have roses at different stages of development coming through the design. So that just adds another layer of interest in the design, and that's a good suggestion. Had I been picking the roses myself, I probably would be able to do that. But as you know, often when you're buying roses, you get them all at the same stage of development. So it's a little bit harder, but I could have manipulated them and taken some of the petals off so they looked smaller, just to give it that graduation of size through the design and having them in the bottom half of the design as well. So there we have our review of bark and roses for this week. If you would like your own designs analysed in this way, just visit the website, follow the instructions there. I'll leave you to your floral art education and journey, and I'll be back next week with another of these videos. I'm Himmeli, and this is Floral Art Review.